In this lesson, we will examine a fast way to mentally calculate percents of numbers. In the question shown here, we are told that a solution is 15% alcohol by volume, and we want to determine the volume of alcohol in 62 gallons of solution. To answer this question, we must answer the question, what is 15% of 62? Now, so far in this module, we have examined two strategies for answering this question. The first strategy was the part, whole, percent approach, where we first identified the part, whole, and percent in the question, and then plugged the corresponding values into the formula to get an equation. When we solve this equation, we see that x is equal to 9.3, which means 15% of 62 is 9.3. Now, another strategy we learned requires us to first rewrite the question in a format that matches the format in this rule. Once we do this, we can plug the corresponding values into the formula to get an equation to solve. Also note that we can rewrite this equation by converting the fraction to a decimal. When we solve either of these equations, we get y equals 9.3, which means 15% of 62 is 9.3. Now, both of these approaches are valid approaches. However, they may require more of our time than is necessary. The truth is, when we are required to find a percent of a certain number, we can often perform the calculations in our head with a high degree of accuracy. Here's how. First, this technique requires us to know how to find 10% of a number. Now, to find 10% of any number, we simply take that number and move the decimal point one space to the left. So, for example, to find 10% of 70, we move the decimal point one space to the left to get 7. Similarly, 10% of 119 is 11.9. 10% of 2.786 is 0.2786, and 10% of 506.4 is 50.64. Now, we also need to know how to find 1% of a number. To find 1% of any number, we simply take that number and move the decimal point two spaces to the left. So, for example, to find 1% of 74, we move the decimal point two spaces to the left to get 0.74. To find 1% of 1578.2, we move the decimal point two spaces to the left to get the following, and so on. Now that we know how to find 10% of a number and 1% of a number, we can use this to find other percents of numbers. Here's how. Let's say we want to find 15% of 62. To do this in our head, we first calculate 10% of 62, which is 6.2. Now here comes the most important part. If 10% of 62 is 6.2, then 5% of 62 must be half of 6.2. So this is equal to 3.1. Now that we know 10% of 62 and 5% of 62, we can see that 15% of 62 will be the sum of 6.2 and 3.1, which is 9.3. So to find 15% of 62, we used our knowledge of other percents of 62 to essentially build up to 15%. Alright, let's try another one. Can you calculate 2% of 41.3 in your head? Well, to do this, we need to find a way to build 2% from what we know about 10% and 1%. Well, we know that 1% of 41.3 is equal to 0.413. So to get 2%, let's write this a second time. From here, we can see that 2% of 41.3 is equal to 0.413 plus 0.413, which is 0.826. Alright, let's try one last question. I'll give you a moment to find 55% of 18. Now, there are several approaches we could take here. A fast approach is to first recognize that it is relatively simple to find 50% of 18. This is equal to 9, since 50% of 18 is the same as 1/2 of 18. Next, if 50% of 18 is 9, then 5% of 18 must be 1/10 of 9, since 5% is 1/10 as large as 50%. In other words, 5% of 18 must equal 0.9. Another way to reach the conclusion that 5% of 18 is 0.9 is to first find 10% of 18, which is 1.8, and then find 5% of 18 by taking half of 1.8, which is 0.9. Alright, at this point we can find 55% of 18 by adding 9 and 0.9 to get 9.9. So 55% of 18 is 9.9. Alright, let's summarize. In this lesson, we learned a fast way to calculate percents of numbers.